This on? Mic's not on. Hello. Can you hear? Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Hello again. For those of you who missed the plenary session, I'm Osama Rahman, director of the Data Science Campus at the ONS. And because I think it's obligatory to say something about Manchester at the start of each session, I cannot tell you how delighted I am that they serve hot Vimto at the coffee shop right there. Right? You don't hot Vimto. If you haven't had it, you're not from Manchester. If you never had hot Vimto, highly recommended. It's and then if you do a tour of Manchester, go see the Vimto statue by the Alan Turing stuff. Very important. Okay. As I mentioned in the plenary session earlier today, so at the ONS, we do actually do some work with developing countries. Hence, you know, a bit of focus today on development issues. And we had Professor Rohini Pandey earlier on doing a plenary session, and we've had a contributor session on development economics. So now we're going to have a slightly more free-form panel session. It's kind of, there's a loose structure at least. We're going to talk a little bit about sustainable development goals, you know, coming up with multidimensional measures, challenges of collecting data in developing countries, and how when looking at complex issues, one thing gets better and then another thing gets worse. So having said all that, got a fantastic panel here. So first of all, we have Dr. Paula McLeod, known to many people in the statistics world, because Paula is head of profession for statistics at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And then we have Dr. Suman Seth. He is associate professor in economics at Leeds Business School and research associate at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. And finally, Dr. Sonya Krutikova, who is associate professor of economics at the University of Manchester in the wonderful Arthur Lewis building, which those of you into economics and into your economic history and into development really should have a look at and get a picture of yourselves next to the Arthur Lewis photo plaque there. And she's at the University of Manchester, and she's also deputy research director at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, who most of us know about. Great. Okay. Going to have a great discussion. I'm pretty sure of that. And hopefully we will generate lots of questions from the audience. So I'll start with Paula. So why should we in government and the statistical community be interested in the sustainable development goals and the many, many targets under them and their measurements and sort of issues around them in general?
Well, thanks, Osama, and thanks for inviting me along. It's a wonderful room to be in. So why should we care about the SDGs? They've been set out as the blueprint of humanity's higher aspirations, the highest aspirations, the 17 goals or the 5 Ps of people, planet, peace, prosperity, and partnership, which really set out what we expect from the world now and into the future. And the key amongst those Ps is partnership. It is a global partnership, which sets out not just what we will do as individuals, but collectively how we improve lives and well-being for every member of society in every country across the world. Sometimes you might be familiar with that phrase of think global and act local, where it's a big framework, but all of us are empowered to really make a change in our lives, in how we live in our local communities. And all of those little ripples add up to a huge and significant global impact. And that call to action was issued to all countries back in 2015, regardless of developed or developing, low, middle, high income. These are a framework that apply equally to all of us in terms of setting out the world that we want to live in. And at the time that they were declared, it's important to note that they were endorsed by every member state of the UN. So that gives us the global consensus that these are the policy priorities that we should all be working out over that 15-year period from 2015 to 2017. And at that point, you'd expect there's going to be a suitably emotive statement. And it was that the future of humanity and our planet lies in our hands. It was absolutely critical to get that unanimous endorsement, the collaborative design that went into the framework in order to really coordinate that pathway to action. You may sort of be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals as a follow-on from the Millennium Declaration, the Millennium Development Goals, which were a really important step in terms of the first times we've put quantitative measures against political commitments. So as soon as you've got a measure on it, you can hold ourselves to account for delivery and making progress. The Sustainable Development Goals really lifted that ambition. And with that, you start to get to that point that we've gone to 17 goals, 196 targets, which reflect that complexity of the interlinkages between each of those goals. We cannot deliver any one of these in isolation. You don't tackle poverty at the expense of the environment. You don't get health and educational well-being without economic prosperity, and none of these can come at the disadvantage of any of the others. It also reflects the politics of if you're going to get a global consensus, it's not top down. Nobody gets to say what's the one measure. It has to speak to that multitude of needs in the multitude of contexts. That's how we got the buy-in from the policymakers, and then it comes to us as the analysts to come up with a framework that make this a quantitative measure, that bring this to life, bring the visibility. And in the words of Amina Mohammed, she's recently written to all countries, all member states, to highlight the fact that we cannot treasure what we cannot measure. So you have to have that visibility that comes with the SDG framework. And it's a really important time to be talking about this. We are just past the midpoint of the SDGs. Hopefully many of you will have seen the progress report that was published last September, some of the SDG midpoint. And this it's a mix of some really stark statistics in there, saying that half the targets are showing that we've made weak or insufficient progress against our objectives, that trajectory that we need to see to get to where we want to be by 2030. And over a third have actually stalled or gone into reverse. And we know there's a big COVID shock associated with some of that withdrawal, but we also know that it's a result of insufficient effort and investment in really moving forward that agenda. But hidden in that was a really important statistic, which is 70% of those targets now have data being regularly reported. All of them have an agreed methodology. So we've actually, despite every challenge, we've made the progress that says we can see a pathway to how we can report against it. And it's not necessarily bad to see that an indicator is off track. What is bad is if you cannot see it at all. That is the key point, to bring visibility to these challenges. And that applies to having the measures. It also applies to having the disaggregation. We don't want to just see a country as a whole or a population as a whole. We need to see that visibility, the gender, the age, those key characteristics that bring down to a local level of relevance. And we also need to recognize the power dynamic that comes with that data dividend, that asset. If you are not represented in the data, policy will not represent you, action will not be targeted against you, you will be missed from decision making. So you have to be represented in the data. We have to have that granularity and that disaggregation, but you also need to have access to that data. Data techniques should not be purely extractive. It's not for us to sit in Manchester talking about really interesting statistics. They have to apply to those communities, to those people. They have to have an equitable access to the data assets that we're talking about. And a big part of this is thinking about our traditional techniques, our methodologies that we so rigorously apply and craft at this the global level, thinking about how we make those applicable to the context and the relevance of needs at a local level, and bringing in new data sources, be it legitimizing citizen-generated data or NGO-type data, and really bringing those into the custodian of the credible and independent commentary on the SDGs, which is the National Data and Statistical System. That has to be the home for this. We are very privileged, as we sit here, to have a well-functioning, independent national statistical system, and that right is not afforded everywhere equally, but we need to keep talking about the importance of that with where we are, because that accountability, that empowerment is key to delivering against that blueprint for humanity. That's why you care.
Oh no, I having got to know you, I'm passionate about the SDGs now. There you go. See, exactly. And it's great. It's fantastic to see Paula's not actually the only person here today wearing an SDG badge. My excuse is my nieces have stolen mine because I've taught them that this is important stuff. Great. So there's 17 goals and lots of targets underneath, and there's all sorts of issues about multidimensionality. Suman, a lot of your work has been focused on poverty measurement and actually, taking multidimensional approaches to poverty measurement and including the importance of the use of non-monetary measures. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Osama, for putting together the panel, and thank you so much, Paula, for setting the tone. I typically work. I'm a methodologist. I work on various methodological improvement, and I had the honor to work with Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative for 5 years between 2010 and 2015, where we developed these multidimensional poverty index that was that is reported annually with the human development within the Human Development Report of published by the United Nations Development Program. Before I move to these particular measure that Osama mentioned, I'd like to sort of highlight that there has been a good motivation even before the SDGs or the MDGs to look at poverty and well-being from a multidimensional lens. Yes, as an economist, I cannot ignore the importance of income, GDP, but sometimes it is not enough to understand well-being and poverty from just a single lens. In terms of motivations, of course, we can look at the report, Sarkozy Commission report produced by Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Pitossi. All these multidimensional well-being and poverty has been motivated by Amartya Sen's capability approach, which cannot be ignored here, basic needs approach, the social exclusion approach in Europe, as well as the pioneering report on voices of the poor produced by Dipanaran and co-authors as part of the World Bank. And of course, when we look at different indicators and their progress, whether they're the Global Monitoring Report or other indicators, when we plot them, we do not generally see, whether at cross-section or intertemporally, that income indicators such as income poverty rate, such as economic growth, they move hand in hand with other indicators such as child undernutrition, lack of education, lack of access to sanitation facilities, water supply, and so on. So, but then the issue is how to put together these different indicators into one index. I mean, it has been acknowledged even in the Sarkozy Commission report and various other parts, and especially those who work in policy, that single metric is very powerful. Yes, we can have 17 goals, 196 targets, but for certain goals, it's very important that we have a single number. It's very important. So when we have all these different dimensions, indicators, how to put them together into a framework that is policy relevant at the same time methodologically strong. I mean, we academics, we always want techniques to be methodologically sound and so on, but there is always a challenge, a trade-off, how to convey it at the ground level so that people adopt it. And from my personal experience going to, we used to train different statistical officers, statistical teams in different countries. And I remember one interaction with the Jordanian statistical office. And we were talking about income poverty. We went there to talk about multidimensional poverty as well, but we were talking about income poverty. Then there are different indicators. Some of you, those who have some knowledge about poverty measurement, poverty rate is probably the most well-used indicator of poverty. You have a poverty line and you count just the number of poor. Then there are other indicators such as poverty gap, square poverty gap. They're sophisticated measures. So this statistician asked me, look, Suman, I understand my boss is a politician. So I understand how to convey to them about how many people are poor. Get that? Then you talk about poverty gap, the distance from the poverty line. I still understand that. I can go and explain to them. But then when you go to much more sophisticated measurement, I understand you need them, you want them to be prioritarian. That means you want to focus on the poorest of the poor, but I have no way of going and explaining it to my boss. So that's why we don't use them. So what happens is that a lot of measurement techniques that we develop, sometimes they do not end up going into policy because they are technically sometimes so sophisticated they're hard to convey. So when we are doing poverty analysis and when we have multiple dimensions, there are different ways we can try to combine. United Nations Development Program, they created an index called Human Poverty Index. Many of you may have heard. There was a version for developing countries. There was a version for industrialized countries. And the idea was they had 4 different indicators: lack of sanitary, lack of water access, life expectancy rate, and so on. Various indicators put together to create a composite index. Then the problem was there was no discussion about how many poor people were there, who are identified as poor. So when we are measuring poverty, 2 key questions is, one, how many poor people are there? That means, can we identify who these poor people are? And then, of course, we find out, we aggregate them to come up with an index which is used for policy so that you can say at the end of the day, poverty has increased or decreased. So what we did with the methodology was developed by Sabine Alkire at OFE, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and Professor James Foster, who is at the George Washington University. They created these particular index of multidimensional poverty, and of course, it was motivated by one of Sir Tony Atkinson's article on what is called counting approach. And based on that methodology, we created the so-called multidimensional poverty index, which is still used, which is also adopted by different countries. I'm working on a small project with an NGO in Kolkata, who also were trying to sort of identify the slums to make their poverty targeting based on this multidimensional methodology, understanding where the priorities lie, and so on. Now, when we aggregate these indices from a technical point of view, there are different ways these statistical officers can do. Sometimes they aggregate these macro indices, as I give the example of Human Poverty Index. And then sometimes we need to go at the household level data, and probably we will have further discussions about the household level data and sort of build up these poverty indices from there, which are methodologically more challenging and different issues come up over there. So that's sort of the discussions about multidimensional poverty indices that we use as part of the developing country assessment.
Thank you. It's interesting because there's a lot of work going on around GDP and beyond, but it's still about trying to price these things into GDP. But colleagues who work in that are much better versed on that. Just sort of going back a bit, as you said, down sort of a bit more to household levels. Now, Sonya, you do a lot of, you're involved in collecting longitudinal data in developing countries and doing evaluations and providing advice to government. So can you tell us about some of that work, and particularly work in relation to SDG 4.3 around children's access to quality early development, care, and primary education?
Yep, great. So thanks for inviting me as well. Nice to be here. Yeah, so this is sort of drilling down and thinking about research around, say, taking just one of these sub-goals of 4.2, which is around provision of quality early childhood care and education. And I think the departure point in that work has been that, as we can see in the fact that there is an SDG on this, the case that early childhood development has been made, and it has been made through high quality research, using longitudinal data, using evaluation. So we know early childhood is in a really critical stage for development. We also know that well-designed, well-implemented programs can have remarkable long-run benefits. This is still disproportionately evidence from high-income countries, but there is some international evidence as well. So that's kind of, that case has been made. Early childhood care and education is working its way up government agendas, and that's good news for this SDG. But then we kind of come to the next set of research questions, which is, with all of this momentum, how do we implement early childhood care and education programs successfully at scale in the context where they're most needed? That's a different research agenda, and that's kind of where my research is, including through FCDO-funded large program of research on exactly this, scaling of ECCE. Now this research focuses not on whether early childhood care and education programs can work. There's a lot of really clean, really careful work on that, showing that they can. But how to embed something we know can work into real ecosystems with all of the constraints, the multiple constraints, and all of the heterogeneity, all of the differences across contexts that we see. And so here, questions become a little bit different. We still care about these overall impacts. So we are still very carefully studying impacts of these programs. But then we're starting to say, well, what is the ideal package of programs that governments should be implemented? How do we combine them within time and across time? What are the core ingredients that absolutely must be maintained with fidelity, and what can we let go of? How do we ensure that quality is sustained? How do we build in monitoring and evaluation systems? So this research actually speaks to something Paul mentioned. It really is more so than I think previous research, fundamentally situated within the specific context where these programs are being implemented. And that role of understanding the local context, the local infrastructure, the local culture, and the political landscape becomes really first order. So this is sort of talking generally. I thought I would just talk through a specific project that I've been working on for a long time to kind of demonstrate that path and that evolution of the research in trying to kind of meet some of these goals that Paul was talking about. So I've been working in Ghana for the last 10 years with an NGO there called Lively Minds, and they're doing exactly what I'm talking about. So they're taking core ingredients that we know work, which is parenting programs with very simple curricula that we know can work, and they're embedding it in infrastructures in Uganda and Ghana. And embedding it means you have the core ingredients, the infrastructure available is very different. In Uganda, they're working through the community health workers. In Ghana, they're working through the universal preschool system, which exists there already. So what does that mean? They're bringing the program and they're implementing it in partnership with the government through the preschools, bringing the parents into the preschools. So I've worked with them on their path from starting that work in Ghana and making that first case that a program like this can work in that context through a smallish randomized controlled trial, just showing that the program has significant positive impacts on child development, but also starting to tease out what's essential about their program, what's the critical ingredients, and what's working in their curriculum and what's working less well in their curriculum. So helping them fine-tune that program in that initial piece of research. Second step was making the case to government. And here that really, some of the things Suman said really resonate. It's very challenging because of the measurement challenges that we face in this area to make this clear-cut, simple case to government about a program being effective. So one of the challenges is around how big are the impacts. So we measure impacts in early childhood, especially. We measure impacts in terms of standard deviations usually. That's not a very meaningful metric, but it's very hard for us with all of the different measurement tools and without kind of universal standards to be coming up with something that's a little bit more tangible and that's a little bit more comparable across different studies, which leads to the next problem of, are these effects big or small compared to other programs? Well, if we're talking about standard deviations, it sort of also depends on what the distribution looks like. In a narrow distribution, the standard deviation is something different from in a very wide distribution. So comparison of effect sizes across programs becomes very tricky. And then the big question, which is, well, what are the long run effects? What does this translate into? We're glad that our kids are happy, but the case for early childhood has been around long run gains. What are those long run gains? Well, we know these estimates for the US. James Heckman has done great work in terms of really giving a number, giving a rate of return to these programs. We can't do that in the lower middle income country context. In Ghana, we're working. We don't have the kind of longitudinal data sets or the kind of long run follow-up that's really going to allow us to credibly identify what are these long run effects. And so the challenge in making the case to the government has been that there's all of these kind of gaps in the evidence and the methods available to us that mean that it's very hard to communicate these benefits and to really build that case. So we were lucky and had a very responsive and close relationship with the Ministry of Education in Ghana, who found our evidence from the initial trial convincing and have scaled the program. So the final step is really this research around what do you do when the government is scaling the program? This is now being scaled to over 1 million children. It's being delivered to over 1 million children across 1/3 of the rural districts in Ghana. So we've worked with the Ministry of Education to embed another randomized control trial in order to continue seeing whether there are impacts, but critically answer questions around what are the key ingredients, not of the program, but of that wider ecosystem into which it's being embedded that are necessary for success. The wider ecosystem is in this case, the education services that are being delivered at the local level. And so here our big research challenge again is around measurement. So how do we measure organizational practices when we're talking about local government? We've borrowed a lot from the World Management Survey group, who've developed tools for measuring practices in firms, in schools, and hospitals. We're trying to adapt them to measure practices in government, to borrow from the literature on motivation in organizations and have some measures from that. But really the tools, we have very good tools for measuring specific impacts of very specific behaviors, but kind of thinking about this wider context, how we measure it and how we integrate it into our research is a big challenge in this agenda as we start to ask questions about not whether something can work, but how it works in a particular system. So I think that's kind of the critical features of the scaling up agenda, which is really speaking to realizing some of these goals, is this local partnership point, because understanding the context requires that, focusing on that wider ecosystem and really moving the needle on the kind of measurement tools that we have and the methods we have in order to be able to do that rigorously.
Thank you. So we've gone from sort of the goals to sort of more aggregate multi-dimensional measures around poverty, to sort of the household, measuring things at the household level in terms of evaluations and trials, looking at what works, scaling up, sort of, advice to governments and continuing to get evidence. Sort of in terms of all this, Paula, I mean, how does this tie into FCDO priorities in terms of data collection, evaluations, policy advice and interventions in developing countries?
Yeah, so I mean, the golden thread that's hopefully starting to emerge across what we've all said is around visibility and voice. Recognizing that multidimensionality and intersectionality of needs that we all have, regardless of where we sit, but are more pressing and more critical in certain countries and certain communities. And it's taking that visibility and translating it into evidence for policy. That's how we drive investment through governments, domestic resource mobilization, getting our efforts flowing to the right priorities. It's how we ensure there is accountability. That visibility is absolutely critical to allowing all of us to really hold each other to account for delivering as needed and taking action. If we've seen something, it is difficult to ignore it. If you're hidden in data, if you're hidden from policy, it is easy to be overlooked. So that's sort of really that golden thread around visibility. And there's also been a really important point around clarity of messaging that comes through in FCDO priorities. We don't just need to know what, we need to know so what. And what next? Why are we doing this? We know resources are constrained everywhere. And we need to make sure that every effort, every penny of our investment is being directed to the most impactful, the most areas of critical need. And that is a really important point of understanding the complexities of some of the techniques that we've talked about. We have to be able to translate it into a language that is universally understood within government, within society. And bringing it back to sort of the FCDO, so it's the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. We are a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Development. We can't they're not different concerns. It is it's how we as the UK deliver internationally. But when we come down to sort of really thinking about the SDGs, you may have seen that last autumn we published our white paper for delivering in a contested world. And I think the target there, sort of the title speaks to our biggest priorities, which is tackling extreme poverty and dealing with climate change. Those are the sort of the most pressing challenges that we're dealing with. You'll also see a lot about a contested world and the ever increasing complexities of geopolitics. We don't have a mandate to just go and fix the world. That's never going to work. But we have to navigate that sort of that incredibly complex environment, which speaks to locally led partnerships, people that actually, we don't get to decide. It's for people to tell us as government what matters most and where we can be most effective. And that strategy focuses around delivering the 2030 agenda. We are committed and we remain committed. We've heard that call to action around really accelerating our progress. The UN have identified a number of accelerative actions, one of which is data. This is the dividend that if we're investing in these systems and shining a light, it has a multiplier effect across all of our development goals. The same as you have the multiplier effect of gender equality or education. It's an investment that continues to deliver a dividend. And this is, and key to this is, again, is leave no one behind. This isn't about one part of the solution. This isn't about fixing one part of it. Where we talk about the SDGs, it is about, we recognise in the foreign, we've got a policy that's based around that intersectionality. It's no one part of it in isolation, and absolutely cutting across all of it is making sure that it's sustainable progress for everyone. And our goals now remains focused on accelerating action towards those 2030 targets, embracing the evidence that you've talked about and ensuring it's translated and applied so that whilst resources are constrained, we are doing the best that we possibly can in delivering those locally led partnerships.
Of course, we were both at the UN Stats Commission earlier this year, where a lot of the discussion was around the need for more data and better data in support of measuring progress against the SDGs.
Yeah.
So it's a massive issue. Sonya, we've discussed briefly interaction between SDGs and some of the work done around early childhood development. But actually, sometimes what happens with these things is you do something and something improves. Yeah, something else over here gets worse. And some of your work, I think, has picked up on some of those things. Can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah, so in that very much speaks to you about all of this, kind of taking account of that whole picture. So I actually have 3 examples I wanted to give briefly of that sort of sometimes that tension. The first one, just speaking to the early childhood agenda that I have just spoken about, and thinking about the early childhood goals and the gender equality goals. And here, this is a new agenda, and this has been very much underexplored. But the concern here is a lot of the early childhood programs they rely on women and a female workforce to deliver them. And really no one has looked at impacts of these programs, even on mothers, let alone thinking really carefully about that female workforce. And so as we're scaling early childhood and we're focusing on effects on children and the kind of long run returns, we might be forgetting about what this is doing to another goal, which is our gender equality goal. Why might this affect mothers adversely? These programs can be very burdensome. You are working with a vulnerable group. They can be empowering. They can also be disempowering when you're coming and telling somebody how to parent. They're reinforcing gender stereotypes. They typically target mothers because mothers are looking after kids, and they reinforce that role and make it even more prominent. Female workforce, these are community health workers. These are women who are any program that comes in, especially to more marginalized communities, they usually rely on like one woman who's delivering everything. These are women who typically have very low status in the workforce. They're typically very overburdened. And there's really, and they're asked to do some impossible things. So a good example is in the preschool system in Ghana, what they're being asked to do is implement play-based learning, where you sit on the floor and play with a group of kids. There's one teacher per 50 children. How do you do play-based learning with that ratio when you have 53-year-olds in your classroom? And so this is something where we have to think about this carefully. As we scale, this becomes a bigger and bigger problem. So to what extent not taking account of these wider effects can potentially be an issue. The other example I wanted to give here, I have more numbers, is in terms of poverty reduction on the one hand, and again, gender equality. So on the whole, we have great reason to think that there is very good intersection between the two, in the sense that poverty reduction, there's lots of mechanisms through which it could lead to greater gender equality, as we have seen in higher income countries. And there's also good reason to think that reducing gender inequality can reduce poverty as well. We have those arguments worked out very well, and the case for that has been put forward, and that's usually what we talk about. But we do see some concerning trends in some countries that we shouldn't be ignoring. And in particular, this is in context with very strong cultural favoritism of men. We're actually seeing that as some countries are getting richer, the gender inequality on some dimensions is getting worse. So, and in some pretty extreme ways. So one way is worsening sex ratios. So we're seeing rapidly worsening sex ratios in China and India. And how is that happening over the last 30 years? Those are both countries that have seen rapid economic growth. So the technology that allows to implement sex-selective abortion, for example, has become cheaper and more accessible. And so in some sense, in that example, the economic development and reduction in poverty is allowing people to kind of pursue or subscribe to implement the norms that are in place more closely. Another example is persistence of abnormally low female labor force participation and declining female labor force participation in India, again, over this period of rapid economic growth. And a wider problem, which is much less spoken about. In fact, I think there's research I'm about to cite is one of the few bits of evidence we have. Growing problem of growing seclusion of women in general. This is not just about female labor force participation. This is about women not leaving their houses more and more. So, and this is something we don't observe because we need time use surveys and kind of data that's actually hard to come by. It speaks to Paula's point about the things we don't measure, we can't do anything about. And so this seclusion, I think I just give you some numbers from research that's being done by Alison Andrews at Oxford University using India time use data. 45% of women in India are not leaving their house at all during the day on average, compared to 4% of men. If they go out unaccompanied. And this trend is getting worse over time. So if you compare 1998 to 2019, women are spending 30% less time out of the house than they used to in 1998 in India. And where the change is happening is among the lower socioeconomic groups whose behavior, as the country gets richer, their behavior becomes more and more like the behavior of the richer groups. And so that seclusion is becoming more prevalent. So as the result, we have the share of women not leaving the home has increased threefold in the last 20 years over the time of rapid economic growth and reduction in poverty in India. So really quite concerning trends going in opposite direction in a linked way. I think I'm going to stop there because I have another example, but maybe in later discussion.
Maybe bring it later.
Yeah.
And on a similar theme, Suman, I mean, even so that's about how things, one thing gets better here, another thing gets better there. But even with some measures, something might look like it's improving, but actually there's questions about, is it improving for everyone? So for example, you've done work that looks also at changes in the depth of deprivation, which isn't always covered. So can you talk a bit about that work?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on both Paula's discussion as well as Sonia's discussion on measures, properly measuring things is quite important. Given that now the number of indicators are improving, we have more and more data, we are receiving different kind of data, okay? Most of the indices and techniques that are available for measurement, whether it is inequality, poverty, and so on, they were mainly based on, say, income data. Take the example of Gini coefficient, for example. Yeah. If you believe, say, you have two situations where you have an income distribution of, say, 10 and 100, and if you change it to 20 and 200, would you say these two distributions are equally unequal? Some of you would, some of you may not. Yeah. So for income, the main motivation is that, yes, if you change all incomes from pounds to dollar, inequality should not change. And that has been the main motivation, saying, these two distributions should be identical. Many people may disagree. Sometimes our variables are not cardinal and continuous. They're ordinal, they're ordered categorical. They may have boundaries. So as the income increases, or at the average of the variable increases, you may get a natural Kuznets curve shape, but that is a mathematical artifact. That's nothing to do with increase or reduction in inequality over time. Yeah. So I think what we have to do, we have to invest more time also to measure properly. As you mentioned, that we have the data, we have increasing the volume of data, but do we have proper measurement? So the measurement tools need to be developed. A good example that I can give you, suppose we are trying to understand cross-country convergence or cross-country inequality in terms of survival rate of children. Of course, it's a bounded variable, it's a rate variable. If we simply apply Gini coefficient across this cross-country data, if we observe that the inequality in survival rate has improved, the inequality in mortality rate is bound to go down because of the mathematics of this particular index. So some people in measurement literature call it an inconsistency problem. So in order to do that, people suggest, use an absolute measure such as standard deviation or variance and so on. When we do that, we tend to see that there is, with some simulations, that you tend to, as the average increases from the lower bound to the upper bound, you tend to see a natural tendency of an inverted U-shaped curve. Now, if we try to track it over time, whether the inequality is increasing or decreasing, we should be able to naturally state, depending on the average at this moment, whether the inequality will go up or go down. It has nothing to do with whether actually it is going up or going down. So different kind of measurement tools are probably required than what we already know of or what already exists. So it is quite important that this kind of, so just beside looking at proper indicator, as you mentioned, that the social norm, for example, plays an important role, how things are changing over time. Just like that, based on the data, how we create the summary statistics, those issues need to be properly looked at. And as you said, I think, Osama, you wanted to mean about measurement with ordinal variable that you had in mind, that in general, when we have variables such as income, it is much easier to look at the depth from the poverty line, because here the difference makes sense. When we have ordered categorical variable, for example, the WASH program of the UNICEF and World Health Organization use different sanitation categories. They have a ladder, sanitation ladder, where you have open defecation is the worst, improved access to toilet is the best, and then you have other categories. How to assess deprivation in that kind of variable where the difference between categories do not make any sense? We do not have any meaning between difference in categories. So again, our existing tools need to be revised so as to be aligned with the sustainable development goal, to meet different sustainable development goals and beyond.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to sort of sum up, not for the sake of summing up, just it's interesting, and we go back to Rahim's talk today, there was something about having goals. We're talking about the SDGs, earlier it was about climate change abatement, the importance of measurement and how measurement matters, but it's difficult, it's multidimensional. But if you have measurement, it allows for accountability, which is important. But you've got to be careful, because the accountability exists on that which is measured, and the stuff you're not measuring is where you may see some adverse effects. I think there's connections between the two talks. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. So who would? I think there's microphones. Lots of hands up. Okay, there's a whole bunch on that side of the room. The gentleman 5 rows back had his hand up first.
Thank you. I'd like to put a question which also came up yesterday afternoon, and that is whether it is actually possible to deal with single indicators and the aggregation of an extraordinarily large number of targets and sub-targets. Is it actually possible to do that? Is it meaningful to do that? We heard a little bit about conflicts between objectives, and Sonya at the end gave some very good examples of that kind of thing as well. Is it not better to, and I quote somebody's slide from yesterday, focus on 1 or 2 discrete areas rather than an aggregation?
Who would like to pick up that one first?
I can try
Yeah.
to try, and then other can support. When we talk about aggregation, I think I don't have in mind to aggregate all the sustainable development targets into one indicator. People love ranking. People love to have one answer, whether it has improved, whether it has not. Where I would agree with you is that it is not possible because we have different subpopulations, for example. Some indicators are probably, say, women's participation in the parliament is a different kind of indicator where you are talking about child undernutrition. So now these different subpopulations are really hard to aggregate. So that's why I said the classification of this aggregation becomes important. So some aggregations are at the macro level, where you have different macro indicators. You sum up, come up with one index, and you have actually 2 extremes here. So you can either leave all indicators separate. Suppose you have a vector, and then you look at the vector over time. You only say an improvement has taken place when every element in that vector has improved, a vector dominance. That would be one extreme. The other extreme, sometimes policymakers like to just club them up into one number so that they can sell it to their, so politics is very important here. So from, I'm perfectly okay to be able to say, 2 situations are incomparable. So complete ranking for me is not a necessity. But sometimes political reasons, policy reasons, sometimes it is important. And as economists, we always love to aggregate, like we love aggregations. So we've come up with different methodologies, but it is based on the need. So no, we don't have to aggregate all the time. It is not possible. It is not feasible to aggregate everything all the time. But if there is need, if strong need, probably we have to go and aggregate. But I'm open to that.
Anyone else?
No, I suppose just really emphasising this point of this isn't Lord of the Rings. It's not one number that's going to cure all of this or that informs everything. It is about responding to what is the policy need, what is understandable, what is impactful in that context, but also these have to be numbers that you have to have credibility, you have to have trust. And that means that across society, people can understand what's in it. And when sometimes it's not meaningful, but there's a reason to it. If we're looking at, and beyond GDP and the discussions we're having is a great one, that as complex as it is, people have the concept of GDP. It's something that has a meaning. And when we're starting to look at bringing in additional dimensions, it gets really complicated. How do we build society's understanding of what this is and ensuring that you're engaging in the same way? This is data, these are indicators that can't be elitist. They can't just sit with a few people. They have to be understood by many, even if people like Suman and Sonya and you very, very clever people do very, very clever things. It has to translate to a story, which is not just, and this is another sort of key buzzline, it's not just on the SDGs, it's for the SDGs. It's informing discussion, progress and action. So it's a bit of a roundabout one, but we need all of it. It just has to be understood and it has to be credible.
Can I just give, and not in SDGs, it's too big for me, even in my narrow, kind of just thinking about even my narrow field of early childhood, there's so many important distinct indicators, mental health, versus physical development versus cognitive development, and even within cognitive development, they're meaningful. They have different mechanisms in which they affect outcomes, and they are individually tell us a lot. But the way that Heckman made the case for early childhood was with the rate of return number. And I've been in many meetings at the World Bank and other places asking for that number for Ghana, for what do we need to, and there's so many assumptions that we have to build into that number. You know, the peri-preschool, that sample size is 65 treated people. That's what the estimates of rates of return in peri-preschool are based on a tiny sample. Or the way that we extrapolate by using various longitudinal data sets in order to see how small change in early childhood affects earnings and crime and other indicators that we can then quantify in terms of, in monetary terms. It is a very, in some sense, you really feel like it's really tenuous. But on the other hand, like the reason that is in the SDGs is because I would say we had a number. And so the power of having that one number, I think, shouldn't be underestimated.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question that's come in via slide. I think this is essentially aimed at you, Sonya, if I'm not entirely sure. And I think it might be. So the question is, if the data sets are not comparable by the use of standard deviations, that suggests the data is skewed to different extents. What do you think is the cause? Whereas I think it was more about the sample sizes, wasn't it? And
it wasn't necessarily sample sizes. I think just the point I was getting at is if you're talking about a group of children that's fairly similar,
okay.
The distribution is narrow. One standard deviation improvement is a movement within the distribution that's comparable to a one standard deviation movement in terms of the movement within the distribution, but in terms of how much kids are learning through the program. In a narrow distribution, that one standard deviation in some sort of absolute sense is a much smaller effect than if you're dealing with a really dispersed distribution. Okay. And so in some sense, they're comparable if you're just concerned about movement within the distribution, but usually we really are, we implicitly think that these effect sizes are somehow comparable in a more absolute sense.
Okay. There were definitely a lot more hands that went there. Okay, I've completely lost track of what order they went up in, so I'm going to go there to the middle first and then over there. Actually, I should check, were there any hands up over here?
Thank you very much. So I got the overall comment about this session. This is it's a month's world economic measurement of the household in developing countries. In many survey settings, so because of the resource constraints, we have to survey only either household head or the representative of the household who tends to be men. So there's an underlying limitation in using a household data set to monitor the SDGs or other things. So I think there should be a shift of the focus from household data set to individual data set. In that sense, so I appreciate the Sonya's the experience with the time use data, but it's hugely costly to collect the time use data. So recently, Thailand has discontinued the national level time use data. But I think so. This is a very important aspect to analyze the gender aspect. And I have a question to Suman. So how would you bring the gender aspect in the global MPI, multi-dimensional poverty index? I think so it's a bit difficult to bring the gender dimension in MPI. And so comment or question for Paula is that currently, so SDG 5 is gender inequality, but so inherently, all the 17 SDG indicators can be disaggregated in terms of gender. So would you be considering or suggesting so kind of so bringing more gender aspects in so other SDG indicators, given that many countries have achieved SDG 1 or MDG 1, so or not based on the income type of poverty. Thank you.
So I've got this right. So there was a point for Sonya around actually we're interested in intra-household allocation issues, but you know, is there a challenge if you just interview the head of the household? Forgive me, I didn't quite get the question you wanted to pose. It was a comment. And then with Paula, it was sort of, you've got these 17 things and.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, just sort of going back up the line, it's a really good point. As you say, gender is a specific goal in its own right, but also of its, and this is where I get challenged on my stats, I think there are 95 individual indicators in the SDGs, 86 of which we have available data on for gender disaggregation. And this is part of where we bring in those cross-cutting enablers, which is gender is a goal in itself, but it's also an intersectionality that we expect to see across all of those 17 goals. We expect to see the gender dimensions collected and represented in the evidence that's, you know, as you say, poverty, you know, that disaggregation, that granularity really matters. And I think it feeds to your point of the household framework. It is the framework that we have to operate off. That's how we sort of approach national statistical exercises. You do need the individual data, and it loops back to my point around looking at legitimizing local, you know, be it women's groups, be it citizen-generated data, other ways to complement those traditional approaches that bring the new insights that we've spoken to of shifting the policy discussion around these issues.
I think you have a question for me as well, which is gender into MPI. It's an interesting question. So in MPI, the current one, I know that there is some work going on at OFI with some other researchers who are trying to construct gender-related MPI. The way I see it, can give you sort of my thoughts. So the way currently how MPI is constructed, identification is done mainly at the household level. So you identify the household, and this is a typical problem, as you mentioned, with the household survey versus individual level survey, because in household survey, many of the indicators, they're shared. And these are the kind of adjustment also done in income poverty measurement with household size and household compositions and so on. If you want to compute or create a gender sensitive MPI, of course, you have to probably focus, a narrow focus on the indicators where you have gender level information. For example, education is one of them. Health, there are different demographic health survey, as I know, they have different indicators on health. Yeah. So if you want to construct at the household level, not at the aggregate level. Aggregate level gender inequality exists because they look at life expectancy differences and other performance, and then they try to construct indicators, the macro level indicators. But at the household level, I think if you want to do it directly without the indirect imputations on how much the household sharing is going on, there are a lot of assumptions, and you may talk about it. But probably my suggestion would be to focus on the indicators where you have data on both men across gender to be able to construct.
There were two questions over here.
Thank you, Paul Eakins, UCL. And I'd like actually, and this may not work, but I'd like to shine a bit of a light on the environmental dimension of the SDGs, which hasn't been mentioned yet at all. And for me, the SDGs were an improvement on the MDGs in two great strategic senses. The first was that, firstly, it covered the environment in a much more effective way. The MDGs nodded at sustainability, but didn't do much more, whereas the SDGs take it very seriously. But the second is that they're applicable to all countries, not just developing countries. And a quick shout out for ONS. The ONS SDG website, I think, is outstanding. I don't know if the guys are here who worked on that, but it's really good. And it shows how far the UK has to go to fulfill its commitments under the SDGs. I was involved with UNEP on the measuring progress of the environmental dimension of the SDGs, the two reports that they produced. And there are two really big problems, which I'd just like you to reflect on as you think about the SDGs. The first was that there are 92 indicators across the SDGs that have to do with the environment, but only 12 of them say anything about the state of the environment. The rest are all kind of policy indicators of things that policymakers might like to do in the hope that the environment would get better. And part of our task in measuring progress was to say, is that hypothesis showing through in the data? And the unfortunate answer is no, it is not. there's very little correlation between the different indicators on the policy and between the state of the environment. The second one, which is even more aspirational, is that once we start getting environmental improvements, are we likely to see economic and social improvements? In other words, are there cross-dimensional linkages between those? And there, I was very suspicious that the data would not be up to showing anything, any message, any signal that there might be. And indeed, I think that proved to be the case. So I just like, I mean, Paula, maybe you thought most about the environmental stuff. I've no idea if that's true or not, but just talk a little bit about how this needs to be developed in the next set of development indicators, given that I think the signals coming from the SDGs in environmental sense are not very encouraging. I don't think we've yet cracked how to do this so that they become as meaningful as the extraordinary case study that we heard from Sonya, where people are really using them in order to get progress. In the environmental stuff, that's not happening at all yet.
Yeah, thank you. And it's, I mean, again, it's just highlighting that point that we made at the start of this is intersectionality. You don't get social progress without at the expense of economic progress. That cannot come at the expense of the environment. This is the big point around the SDGs, that it's progress against all of them together. And you're right about it's reflecting our maturity and our ability to measure all of the dimensions on an equitable basis is a continuing work in progress. And I'm not sure if any of you will have seen last autumn as part of that SDG progress report in the FCDO, we did a bit of analysis around SDG interlinkages, and it's some of it is sort of quite intuitive, that richer countries tend to sort of do better in terms of health and educational outcomes. If you're a lower income, more fragile context, then you're more vulnerable to shocks. But one of the sort of the big points that really speaks to what you're saying is that generally higher income countries have made more progress against the SDGs, apart from when it comes to environmental indicators. That progress has come at a cost, and that's something that needs to be balanced. Yeah. And you can't then say to an emerging economy, whoa, you don't get to sort of invest in your carbon markets, or you have to put measures in place against which we've built our economies. We have to find a way to create sustainable investments, you know, that transition to clean energy, that transition to sustainable economic measures. And you're right to keep shouting about it. This is something that we need to be looking at in terms of the beyond 2030 agenda and how we strengthen our evidence base and our approaches, that being the proxy by which we will deliver the action. But it's not a 2030 problem, it's a today issue. It's a yesterday issue that, I'm sort of seeing Richard at the back.
Yeah, nodding away.
Yeah.
I noticed that as well.
How we strengthen those measures, how we bring that to the complexities that Suman and Sonya have both spoken to about bringing a tangible, distilled message to the policy table that enables us to have a confident discussion at that level with the financial institutions, with the private sector, that allows us to make sustainable progress. So that was, yeah, it's sort of a reflection of, right, it's difficult, but it's there. And all of us in the room need to keep persevering with those efforts to shine a light on the challenges of the moment.
And the last question, Joe, because after that, I'm aware I'm keeping you all from the posters and the drinks, but mainly the posters.
Very good discipline for me as well. I'll keep this short. And really what I wanted to ask was a kind of generalized version of actually the point Paul's just made. You'd think that part of the purpose of the SDGs had to be to focus attention and to get political will behind the achievement of these goals. And yet I'm sort of left feeling that certainly in the UK, possibly in most of the world, probably only 1% of the population would know what the SDGs were. And it certainly doesn't figure prominently in kind of everyday public debate in the UK. in the way that other things do. So my question is really, if part of the purpose is to engender support and pressure for action, what lessons would we want to draw from the existing design of the SDGs for the next vintage, which won't be too long away? And in particular, does it really help to have so many targets and so many indicators?
Okay, so before we, I'm going to hand this over to you, but the first thing to do, you want to get people to take account of the SDGs and get passionate about them, just introduce them to Paula. You saw earlier today. That's kind of my solution to that, but the more complex questions Joe's asked. I mean, too many indicators.
Which one's your favourite? Which ones would you drop? You know, how do you navigate that inherent intersectionality?
Well, what I would know is if I wanted to get people interested, then saying here's this group of quite complicated indicators, please take them seriously. Please march down Whitehall and demand that government takes action here and in other countries as well. And I'm just not quite clear that actually the present framework is actually pulling its weight in that respect.
Can I pick up on that slightly?
I mean, it's sort of interesting. I mean, 17 goals. I mean, I suppose there's an action of, do I need to know which goal is gender equality or which is life on land or life in water in order to be able to advocate for those priorities? So there's a question there of, does it matter to every individual? I would also say yes, it does, but it's a language that maybe sort of suggests the state of education, you know, the stages that we've gone through and how we've engaged, how we've exposed. There is the point, you know, as I said at the start, it's 17 goals, it's 5 Ps. We've tried our best with messaging. I honestly, I'm digging myself a hole because I don't know what the answer is. But I think it's important that we think, is it that the 17 goals are too complex and so people can't possibly engage with that breadth of information? Or is it that we think of, you know, I made the point around these being, you know, it's inherently political. It's in a government's interest, if we're failing to make progress, to be less of an advocate for this, to not speak the language, because that is the way that we show underinvestment or lack of progress. So I suppose there's a challenge there. And there's also a challenge back to us as society that if we think people don't know about it enough, what can we all do when we leave the room to carry that message and ensure that it's not reliant on the government of the day to be doing the education, but we're able to bring it into our everyday narratives. And when it comes to looking to 2030, I'm going to be all ears. I'm listening about how it works, and it's the topic of the moment. But right now, we need to focus on accelerating action towards the 2030 agenda. We've got 6 years left, and we know that, you know, we have to step on the gas for this whilst we scan the horizon about what happens beyond that point.
I'm going to completely abuse chair's privilege and have a final comment on this, and with 2 anecdotes. I thought it was interesting. There hadn't been much discussion of the SDGs, but with the Black Park Declaration on AI, it was interesting that that declaration came out, you know, saying that the use of AI in support of the SDGs. That's my first anecdote. My second anecdote, in terms of awareness, maybe it's not important for everyone to know about all 17 SDGs. This is the anecdote bit. I've got my nieces now. There's a bunch of them. They keep on asking me about. Over time, they might ask about land and water, but for now, gender equality and children's education, they keep asking me out when I see them. That's the start. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I am, you know, there's some fantastic posters. There is also drinks, but, you know, the posters are much more important. And I'd like you all to join me in thanking our fantastic panelists. Thank you.